Let's start by looking at the question of the authorship of Acts. We really can't address the authorship of Acts without looking at the we narratives. The majority of scholars think that the we narratives were authored by a companion of Paul, and there's good reason for that. But some scholars demur, and there are also reasons for that. You can tell where I stand because I said good reasons for one and I just said reasons for the other. But in any case, the narratives are far more detailed in the we section. There are more details on the few weeks spent in Philippi than the lengthy stays in Corinth, 18 months and over 2 years in Ephesus. Also, where the we begins and where the we leaves off. In 16:10 and following, we find that the we begins moving from Troas to Philippi. After Paul and Silas leave Philippi, the we breaks off. But years later, when Paul comes back to Philippi in Acts chapter 20, the we picks up again and continues basically until the end of the book of Acts, whenever there's any travel. The we stays in the background. The first person is only mentioned where necessary to include himself without elaborating by mentioning himself, mentioning what he was doing. He's just included in the group. Now, some people have taken the we to be other than what we normally take we to mean. We normally means myself plus someone else. But, scholars, we make our living by making complicated things simple, and unfortunately sometimes by making simple things complicated. So I need to address these other views about we. Some say it must be a fictitious we, and the reason is because they think that Luke's depiction of Paul's thinking differs from the depiction of Paul's thinking in Paul's letters. Well, there's some truth in that. Nobody says that Paul wrote the book of Acts. Obviously, Luke is a different person. But he's not so much of a different person that we must assume that he couldn't have known him or couldn't have traveled with him. After all, if one of my students were to write a biography of my life, and you'd see what they'd choose to emphasize, what they would choose to emphasize about me would be different from probably what I would choose to emphasize about me. In fact, the leading difference that scholars have often seen between Luke's depiction of Paul's theology and Paul's own depiction of Paul's theology is that they say that, well, in Acts, Paul is favorable towards the law, whereas in Paul's letters, Paul is against the law. Well, that's a very tendentious reading of Paul. I won't say historically where it came from, but I will say that in the past few decades, the majority of Pauline scholars have repudiated that view. They no longer say that Paul was against the law. And therefore, scholars of Acts who are using that contrast to try to distinguish Luke's Paul from Paul's Paul need to catch up on their Pauline scholarship. But in any case, why do they assume it's a fictitious we? We have fictitious we's or fictitious I's in fictitious documents, such as novels. We do not have fictitious we's or fictitious I's normally in historical works, which the majority of scholars agree that the book of Acts is. Not all agree on how historical it is, but the majority agree that Acts is a historical monograph, and it's a work of ancient historiography. The famous early 20th century Harvard classicist, Sir Arthur Darby Knock, said that at most he could think of one example in historical literature, in non-fictitious literature, where first person plural or first person period was used fictitiously. In almost all cases in historical works, a first person meant that the author was claiming to be there, or the author was claiming to be writing, or something like that. Moreover, if it were fictitious, Why would it be fictitious only at these places so that it leaves off in Philippi and picks up in Philippi? And it's such obscure places. I mean, you would think that the we would have carried through the entire narrative. The we could have been a disciple of Jesus. The we could have been present at the empty tomb. The we could have been present at Pentecost. But the author can't say that because apparently the audience knows who the author is, and they know when the author was with Paul and when the author wasn't with Paul. The we appears in a very obscure way. The author is not trying to make a big deal about being present. The author is simply including himself at points where the author was present. Some say it's not fictitious, although some have said, well, you have this fictitious presence of a we in sea voyages. That has been very strongly answered by scholars who've shown that most we voyages don't have a we in them. When the we is there, normally it's because the author was claiming to be there. And outside of sea voyages, it's the same as inside of sea voyages. So the majority of scholars have rejected that approach. But some scholars have said, okay, it's not fictitious. It belongs to a travel journal. And that's entirely possible. It's possible that it belongs to a travel journal. But keep in mind, Luke, at the beginning of his first volume, mentions many possible sources. He mentions getting material that goes back to eyewitnesses. Presumably, a lot of the material that came to him could have come in first-person form. And yet, nowhere else does he preserve a first-person form. Why would Luke become an inept editor of his material at this point, and at this point only? Doesn't it seem more likely that if there was a travel journal that was in use, it was Luke's own travel journal? So, if it was a travel journal including we, it would have been Luke's travel journal. In other ancient literature, we normally means we, just like it does today. So instead of complicating what's simple, we'll just leave it simple. Usually I can say I'm in a strong consensus of scholarship. On this point, there is debate, but personally I think that the case is strong enough that I'm willing to say I think this is a really strong case. But who was this companion that is presupposed in the we? Who is this first-person voice? Well, we know of certain people who went with Paul. In Colossians 4:10 and in Philemon 24, he mentions Aristarchus being with him in Rome. However, Aristarchus is specifically distinguished from the first person in Acts chapter 27. So this is somebody who was with Aristarchus and Paul, but was not Aristarchus. Could be Epaphras. Epaphras is also with Paul in Rome, but there's no interest shown here in the Lycus Valley. You would think Epaphras, whose home church, where he labored the most, was in the Lycus Valley. You'd think that would show up somewhere in the book of Acts, but there's no interest in the Lycus Valley there. Demas was also with Paul in Rome, but tradition says that he didn't persevere. Second Timothy chapter 4 says, Demas has abandoned me. So chances are he didn't write the book of Acts. Now, there's another strong candidate who doesn't normally get mentioned, I think, and that's Titus. Titus was a close companion of Paul, and for some reason Titus is not mentioned by name in the book of Acts, unless he's the same person as Timothy, which a friend of mine has argued, but I think there are compelling reasons against that personally. One of which being that we have 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus being separate. But in any case, I think Titus could be a candidate. The problem is that when Paul lists his companions in Rome, Titus is not among them. So there's one companion who's listed in Rome who's not named in the book of Acts, and that's Luke. And not surprisingly, the unanimous the unanimous view of the early church was that Luke was the author of the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. Interestingly enough, you would expect that if somebody were to make up a tradition about some author, they'd make up somebody very prominent as the author. Luke wasn't that prominent. So the external evidence and the internal evidence together both favor Luke as the author. And sometimes, when you speak of an author of a work, you just use the traditional, conventional author's name because you don't have any better name to use. But in this case, when I say Luke, I personally do believe that Luke was the author. Well, the tradition of authorship is very strong. Classicists normally start with the external evidence. And the external evidence here is very strong. The tradition is Luke. The anti-Marcionite prologue actually says that this was Luke, a doctor from Antioch. Colossians 4:14 does fit, Luke being a doctor, although I don't believe he was from Antioch, given what we see in the book of Acts. It says that he stayed single and he died in Boeotia in Greece at the age of 84. I don't know about some of those other details, but it does fit the evidence that Luke was the author. We have stronger evidence from Irenaeus in the late 2nd century, Clement of Alexandria in the late 2nd century, Origen, and Tertullian. Now, to whomever Luke addressed the book of Acts and the Gospel of Luke, they knew who the author was. He didn't have to state who he was. He can say I in the prologue, he can say we later on. Most people who received such works knew who the author was, and it didn't have to necessarily be stated in the body. Sometimes it was, sometimes it wasn't. And in the case of Luke, we know that at least part of his audience, his dedicatee, as part of his ideal audience, is named Theophilus. And Theophilus undoubtedly knew who the author was. So the book didn't have to mention it, but normally the authorship was one of the last details that would be forgotten. And so here we're talking about a few generations where this could be passed on. And we're talking about unanimity. I mean, if it wasn't passed on accurately, you would have different hypotheses arising in different parts of the Roman Empire. But we have unanimity. Also, a papyrus, P75, from somewhere between 175 and 225 AD, calls the Gospel of Luke. And pretty much everybody agrees that the same author wrote both Luke and Acts. Luke was not prominent in tradition, yet the authorship tradition is unanimous. Who would invent a non-apostle and a non-eyewitness of Jesus as the author? We have no evidence against it. It fits what little we know about Luke. And interestingly enough, although this is purely subsidiary argument, many terms frequently found in medical literature are also found in Luke Acts. That was pointed out by Hobart. Cadbury rightly pointed out afterwards that many of these terms are also found in non-medical literature. So it doesn't really make a case for a medical author per se. But as Cadbury pointed out, and scholars have sometimes since then neglected, well, it's consistent with a doctor being the author. And many of the early scholars who are now quoted, like Debelius and others, and Cadbury, were very positive towards Lucan authorship rather than negative. Most of these terms are also found elsewhere too. Harnack notes that, and so on. But you have some more recent studies that have drawn attention, and at Bison Reader and others have drawn attention to, well, it is consistent with the possibility of a medical author.